Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate and the first part of a two-part series with the National Security Advisor. How does the government regard the situation in Pakistan and what might be the implications for India? That's the issue I shall raise today with M K Narayanan. And Mr. Narayanan, let me start with the obvious question. How do you view Pervez Musharraf today?
I think as of now he is an elected president, but the legitimacy of his presidentship will have to be probably declared only after Parliament approves of it with a two-thirds majority, the new Parliament. As things stand, it does seem possible that he would be elected with that majority. If that happens and he is the legitimate president of Pakistan, I think we will do business with him. We have done business with him in the past, and I think we will continue to do business with him.
So he remains, in your eyes, a credible interlocutor for India?
Yes, by and large. I mean, he remains a credible interlocutor to that extent, because we will do business, as I said, with whoever has the mark of, or the stamp of approval in Pakistan.
Now that he's retired as Army Chief, how much of his power and influence has he lost with his uniform?
That's a difficult question to answer, because first and foremost, I think if you accept that the army is the arbiter of destiny in Pakistan, whoever doffs his uniform necessarily does lose a certain amount of his sheen. What he has is a chief of army staff who is a close comrade of his, who is well known and well acknowledged to be a professional soldier. And it is therefore likely that the relationship between the civilian president and the military chief would remain cordial. Now, how long is a matter which it could remain for all time, it could remain for whatever is the length of time. But let's look at the entire scenario. The basic point is that how does a civilian president play out in Pakistan where the army is the most dominant force? I think this is still something that we will really have to look at closely. Next, I think you're going to have possibly a prime minister, who that person is going to be is still in the realm of speculation. Therefore, you are going to have three sort of centers of authority or power. There's a civilian president who was one time president and the army chief. You have the army chief. I mean, the army is definitely the most dominant entity in Pakistan, and you have a civilian prime minister. Therefore, you have three elements now as against one single unified element. Quite clearly, this is going to make a difference to the way matters are carried out or dealt with in Pakistan.
Are you also going to suggest that adjusting to a triumvirate from a previous position where he was the omnipotent power of the country might be a difficult transition for Musharraf?
I should think so. I mean, in all things done, even granting that he would still have a lot of his previous strength, it's going to be difficult. And whoever is the civilian prime minister is certainly not going to accept a position where he is well and truly subordinate to the president in that sense of the term. I'm told today, for instance, who heads the nuclear command or authority, or national command authority, for instance. He has said that I will. Now, I would presume that the head of the government would normally, because it was originally supposed to be the head of the government. Who is the head of the government? Is it the civilian prime minister or the civilian president? I mean, these are the kind of ticklish issues that would need to be sorted out.
In fact, these are the incipient clashes that are likely to happen post-January.
Yes, it is. But I must say, there's a certain amount of grudging respect for the manner in which President Musharraf has managed to overcome some of his previous troubles. I mean, he has moved from a military president to a civilian president. He has managed to see that there's no boycott of the elections to the assembly. To some extent, he has somehow managed to ride the.
And so you think he can also manage these incipient contradictions?
At least definitely in the short term, I think it should be possible. If he manages to do that in the long term, then of course he is really a very, very able person in that.
If I read what you said correctly, in the medium and long term, his future or maybe his survival depends upon that critical relationship with the army chief. It is the loyalty of the new army chief to President Musharraf that will ensure President Musharraf's survival for the full 5 years of his new term.
I think if the army is united and the army remains united, when I'm now referring not merely to the army chief alone, but I think what has President Musharraf achieved in the years that he first as army chief, subsequently as army chief plus president, so on, is that I think he has put all his loyalists in key positions. And to expect that all of them will, so if the army remains united, if the army doesn't sort of have fractious groups coming up within the system, and the army, you have a professional army chief in Mr. Kayani, that's what everybody claims General Kayani is, then a united army who have a lot to sort of continue to have by virtue of privileges and perks, may be willing to back a civilian president. So I think that's about. Now, it's not always that this has happened, but if you look around, even West Asia, I don't wish to name the countries, there are other countries which have done the same kind of transition, and you have army men or air force persons taking over as the president or whatever is the chief executive authority, surviving, and some have survived for nearly 2 decades. So I don't want to mention countries or whatnot. It's not an improbable situation. A lot depends on what are the possibilities.
A lot depends, as you said, on the army staying united, not getting divided by fractions or factions. Do you see the army staying united in Pakistan?
So at the moment, I don't see any signs of any cracks in the system. I think if you take the key core commanders and the various elements, I think they are all in a sense in the same wavelength. Now, when ambitions start sort of becoming, so maybe it may be different. But at the moment, I mean, you can speculate anyway, but I'm looking at it in a practical sense, and I also have to talk, I might say, from the point of view of an Indian NSA looking at it. If I speculate, like maybe strategic thinkers will excoriate me again, like they did last time, for saying what I'm saying. So I think as of now, the position is I don't see any major cracks in the...
Ambitions are in check. They may be there, but they're in check. In that case, the other challenge General Musharraf faces is the strategy he launched to change the character of the Supreme Court, in particular, as you know, to replace the old Chief Justice and to replace recalcitrant judges and put in their place pliant men of his own choice. Has he got away with that?
I don't think he's got away with it. But, you know, what these groups could not manage was to rouse public sentiment against. I mean, finally, you couldn't bring people out onto the streets. I think there's angst, both in the civil society as well as in amongst the judiciary, etc. Translating that into a popular unrest or political protest of it, I mean, political parties just didn't come on, didn't sort of back this. Now, there will be simmering concern, I would presume. I mean, for those of us who believe in democracy, I think, but President Musharraf is on record saying there are that we have our own versions of democracy, and I think he's not the first man to say that. So there are others who have also said it. So my point is, whether he's got away with it, I don't know. I mean, some of these have a long gestation period. As of now, I think he seems to have sort of papered over this problem.
So simmering resentment, maybe even angst, but he papered over the resentment now.
Looks like it, at least to the extent that I...
Let's talk a little about the new army chief, General Pervez Ashfaq Kayani. During 2002 and the tense standoff between India and Pakistan in that year, he was the Director General of Military Operations of his country, and in that capacity he was in fairly regular contact with senior Indian officials. Does that mean that India has a fairly good idea of what sort of man he is, or does he remain a stranger to you?
No, I don't think he's a stranger, but I think there have been contacts, but by nature, the impression about him is that he is a professional soldier. He's not a man with great political ambitions and that kind of, but...
He's not a Napoleon.
He's not, well, that's too much to say, but the point really is, I think the soldiers who know him think of him as a professional soldier. They also think that he is a loyal individual, and that is what makes people think that the relationship between the civilian President Musharraf and the army chief would be reasonably smooth, at least in the short term.
What about one other thing? From 2004 until very recently, General Kayani was also the Director General of the ISI. In that capacity, was he responsible for much of the terrorism India has faced? Or do you subscribe to the view that under him, Pakistan took meaningful, perhaps even credible steps to contain and curb terrorism?
I think the trouble with the ISI quite often is that the leaders sometimes are persons who come in from outside, and they don't remain there long enough to really get a total grip over the organization. And there are the professionals who remain within the organization who have their own ideas and mandates. I don't think the ISI changed under Kayani one way or the other. There was possibly what we believe as a kind of a tactical restraint which was imposed from outside, possibly by President Musharraf, possibly by whatever was the establishment there. But I think that applied only up to a point. In terms of the larger issue about mentoring the Lashkar-e-Taiba, to some extent the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Al-Badr, etc., I don't think there was any fundamental change in the attitude. Now, how far General Kayani as head of the ISI was responsible for this or not, having myself been in the position quite often, there are elements in the system who do things which are not fully and totally known to thee. But the point I'm making is that General Kayani was certainly not a Hamid Gul, if that would answer the question. For those of us who know Hamid Gul, and I think it means
Hamid Gul being a hardliner, Hamid Gul being a man who's almost dedicated
to
pushing terrorism towards India.
And the great author of the belief that bleed India through 1,000 cuts. I think that.
In which case, can I end this part by asking you a simple question? Do you have serious qualms about Kayani, or are you reasonably satisfied with Kayani as the new army chief?
Well, it's not for us to decide. Well, if the answer is, will General Kayani indulge in an adventurous action against India, I think the answer would be no, because I think he's too professional a soldier to attempt it. I think it would be very foolish for anyone of any country today to try any adventurous action or hope that they can sort of catch India in what we call a complacent mood at any moment.
Let's then take a break at that point, Mr. Narayanan. Let's come back and talk about the elections that are likely to happen in January and what they might throw up. We'll be back in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with the National Security Advisor. Mr. Narayanan, in 3 weeks, Pakistan will go to the polls, and the major parties have announced that they will be participating. What sort of outcome are you anticipating?
You are asking me to cast the political horoscope of Pakistan 3 weeks down the road. Here I have to go by what is conventional wisdom, I would say. And I think the conventional wisdom seems to be that no one single party is going to get a majority. What, of course, is significant is the fact that there's no major boycott. Almost all political parties have come into participation. There are smaller parties who are not involved, but the PPP is participating, the PMLN is participating, of course the PMLQ is participating, the Fazlur Rahman's party, the MMA, at least that is part of his. So by and large, there's enough credibility as far as this election is concerned. But the fact is that if the PMLQ and the PMLN are engaged in a conflict, I think the beneficiary is certainly going to be the PPP. But all intents and purposes are all sort of calculations would appear to be that even with all this, the PPP may not get an absolute majority. And I think that's something that I will say President Musharraf wouldn't like to happen. So whatever that means in terms of...
In recent weeks and months, Benazir Bhutto, in interviews that she's given, articles that she's written, has repeatedly committed herself to ending all terrorist camps in Pakistan, to curbing all private militia. She's even talked about the possibility of extraditing Dawood Ibrahim, perhaps even giving India access to men like Hafiz Muhammad Saeed and Masood Azhar. If she were to become Prime Minister of Pakistan in January, would you welcome that?
Well, if she lives up to her promises, most certainly.
Do you think she will?
It's difficult to believe. One has to go by what she did in the 90s, so one is always a little skeptical, but it's possible.
Her track record is therefore against her.
Track record isn't necessarily something which we can make us believe that she would follow to the letter as well as the letter of what she has said. But let me I think even if she wished to, do so. As I mentioned in the first part of the interview, the single most important entity in Pakistan remains the army, and along with that the ISI. I find it extremely difficult to believe that the Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, if she does become that, will have a free hand in doing all the things that she wished to do. I know that in 1988, when she met with Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, Prime Minister, she made a number of promises. Whether she was unable to, we know certainly well that she was immediately sort of curbed by the military on that point. But whether she will have greater success now is, I think, difficult to believe, and I think it would be very optimistic to expect that she can fulfill what she says. But we hope that she will do her best.
Now, General Musharraf, as you yourself indicated in part one of this interview, is hoping that the new assembly will not only ratify his election as president, but more importantly, indemnify the emergency that he declared and the steps that he's taken under that emergency. But if Benazir Bhutto, Nawaz Sharif and their allies, who you've already named, were to end up with 50% or more of the seats in the National Assembly, which very easily they could General Musharraf be in danger?
I think the Attorney General has just mentioned that before the emergency is lifted, I think they're going to put in place a whole series of measures.
But won't those need to be indemnified by the new assembly?
Well, I mean, it's going to be a technical issue, but I think the point is that if there are measures to indemnify the president's actions, then, you know, overturning them by even by an assembly, unless it's such an overwhelming majority, which I think is going to be difficult, makes it much more difficult. And therefore, I would think that President Musharraf may just again, it all depends. I mean, one should read his real horoscope, not the kind of political horoscope that I'm talking of, because I think it may, if they do legally put in place some measures, it's not going to be easy for even an elected parliament, unless it has, say, 4/5 or something to sort of...
Assuming General Musharraf does continue, he overcomes the obstacles that he's facing, he establishes a good relationship with the army chief. Are you confident that sometime by the middle of 2008, he can pick up on the peace process with India and take it forward?
That's what we are hoping, because I think there are things which are in the pipeline, the things which are cooking, which are half cooked or three-quarter cooked, which we would like to take forward. The point really is that it's not merely taking it forward. Would he be able to convince the other power structures that have come up in addition to himself that this is the best thing for Pakistan? Now, that is a question mark, but we are hopeful that if by the time he has overcome all the obstacles, he would have a degree of credibility, a degree of acceptance, which would make it easier for him to do so.
So in a word, he remains, despite all the problems associated, India's best bet at the moment.
Well, you know, I think even in a previous interview I have mentioned this, Mr. Thapar. The point is we will deal with whoever is in place in Pakistan, because I think we are quite conscious. We cannot pick and choose whom we deal with. If the people of Pakistan, with whatever measures they have or whatever mechanisms they have chosen to make him the president, we will deal with him. And we have dealt with him in the past, and that experience, as our Prime Minister has said, has not been something which we are uncomfortable with. So we will go forward with that.
Mr. Narayanan, let's end this particular interview there.